There are things a woman carries in silence for so long that they stop feeling like secrets. They become part of the architecture of who she is. Invisible beams holding up the roof. You forget they are there until something shakes the foundation and suddenly the whole structure groans and cracks and you realize that what you built your life upon was never quite what you told yourself it was. I am 71 years old. My name is Miriam Colette Voss. And the story I am about to tell you is the story of how my son received $30 million, looked at the woman who raised him, and decided she was no longer useful to him. It is the story of betrayal, of grief, of a legal battle that nearly broke me. But more than any of that, it is the story of a secret I kept for 47 years. A secret that changed everything when it finally came to light. Not just for my son. For me. I need you to understand something before I begin. I am not telling you this story to make you pity me. Pity is a weak emotion and I have never had much use for it. I am telling you this because somewhere out there is a woman like me. A woman who gave everything she had, who built a life with her hands and her heart, who believed that love was enough armor against the world. And I want her to know what I learned the hard way. That sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes the truth is the only thing that saves you. So let me start at the beginning. The real beginning. Not the one I told my children for 40 years, but the one that actually happened. I was born Margaret Eloise Harrington. Not Miriam Voss. Not the woman you see now, with her sensible shoes and her Tuesday afternoon church group and her window box of herbs on the sill of a small rented apartment on the edge of a quiet city. I was born Margaret Eloise Harrington of the Charleston Harringtons. And if you are from certain circles in South Carolina, that name still means something. My father was Gerald Harrington. He had built a shipping and logistics empire from a single inherited warehouse on the docks and turned it into a company that employed over 400 people by the time I was born. My mother, Cecilia, was the daughter of a state senator. They lived in a house with 14 rooms, a full-time housekeeper, a cook, and a garden that was tended by two men whose only job was to make it beautiful. I grew up with the weight of expectation draped over my shoulders like a fur coat. Everything I did was measured against what the Harrington name required. I attended the right schools. I wore the right clothes. I was introduced at the right functions to the right young men. My future had been sketched out in pencil long before I was old enough to hold the eraser. And I was good at it. I will give myself that. I was good at being Margaret Harrington. I was poised and well-spoken and I knew which fork to use and how to make small talk with men whose net worth had more zeros than I had years of life. I smiled at the right moments. I said the right things. And underneath all of it I was suffocating so quietly that no one in that house with 14 rooms and 2 gardeners ever once noticed. Then I met Daniel Voss. I was 22. He was 24. He was working that summer as a contractor on the renovation of a library 3 blocks from my father's house. I passed him every morning on my walk. He had dark hair that curled at the collar and hands that were rough from real work, and he read paperback novels on his lunch break, sitting on the library steps with a sandwich in one hand and a book in the other, completely unbothered by the world moving around him. I do not know exactly when I fell in love with him. It was not a single moment. It was accumulation. The way he spoke about books as if they were living things. The way he laughed, fully, without calculating whether it was appropriate. The way he looked at me not as a Harrington but simply as a woman standing in front of him. We met properly in September. We were married the following June. My father did not come to the wedding. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is important. My father, Gerald Harrington, a man who had attended the governor's inauguration 3 times, who had given the commencement address at my college, who called me his greatest pride to anyone who would listen, he did not come to his daughter's wedding because the man she was marrying poured concrete for a living and his family was from Ohio and his father had worked in a mill. My mother came. She sat in the 3rd row of the small chapel Daniel's aunt had arranged and she cried throughout the whole ceremony, and I could not tell then and cannot tell you now whether those were tears of grief or tears of something softer. She died 4 years later of a stroke, and my father and I never fully reconciled, and when he passed away 11 years ago I learned through a letter from his attorney that he had left his entire estate to a charitable trust and a distant nephew I had met twice. That is the kind of man my father was. And that is the world I walked away from. I kept almost nothing from that life. I kept my middle name, Eloise, which I used as a private reminder of who I had been. I kept a small jewelry box that had been my grandmother's, cedar-lined and smelling faintly of her perfume, with a single item inside that I will tell you about later. And I kept the knowledge. The deep, cellular knowledge of what wealth really looks like from the inside, what it does to people, what it asks of them, and what it takes. Daniel never knew. I told him my family was estranged and that I preferred not to speak about them, and because he was the kind of man who respected closed doors, he never pushed it. We built our life in a small house in Greensboro, North Carolina. He started his own small contracting business. I took in alterations and later worked at a fabric shop and eventually managed it. We were not rich. But I had chosen this, every day, with every fiber of my being, and the choosing made it feel like abundance rather than lack. We had 2 sons and a daughter. Marcus was born first. He arrived in the world with his grandfather Harrington's jaw and his father's eyes, and from the very beginning there was something in him that I recognized with a complicated pride. He was brilliant and ambitious and achingly aware of how much more the world seemed to offer other people. He worked hard in school. He earned a full scholarship to Duke. He became a corporate attorney. He married a woman named Serena who had grown up wealthy and who wore her wealth the way some people wear expensive perfume, as a signal, not just a pleasure. Then came Joel. 2 years younger than Marcus, quieter, steadier. He became an electrician like Daniel's brother, and he was proud of it. He had a wife named Carol and 3 children and a warmth about him that filled whatever room he was in. And finally our daughter, Nadia. She had moved to Portland 11 years ago for graduate school and stayed, working as a nurse practitioner in a community health clinic. She called every Sunday without fail. She was the child who asked the most questions and remembered the answers. Daniel died of lung cancer 9 years ago. He had never smoked a cigarette in his life. The doctors told us it was an environmental exposure, likely from decades of construction sites and the materials used in that industry before the regulations tightened. He was 63 years old. He was the best man I ever knew, and I held his hand when he left, and I have never fully stopped grieving him even now. After Daniel died, I moved into a smaller place. A 2-bedroom apartment on Birchwood Avenue with a window box where I grew rosemary and thyme and a small bay laurel that I talked to when I thought no one could hear. I lived on Daniel's small life insurance payout, my Social Security, and a modest amount I had saved over the years, which I had invested carefully through a financial advisor Joel had helped me find. I was comfortable. Not rich. Comfortable. And I was at peace in a way I had not been in the 14-room house of my childhood. My children visited regularly. Joel and Carol came for dinner most Sundays. Nadia flew in for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Marcus came when his schedule allowed, which meant 3 or 4 times a year, arriving in a car that cost more than my apartment and leaving again with the slightly distracted air of a man who was always partially somewhere else. I loved all 3 of them completely. With the specific, calibrated love of a mother who has watched 3 entirely different people grow from the same soil. And I believed, for a long time, that we were fine. The call came on a Thursday morning in early March. I was at the kitchen table with my tea and a crossword puzzle when my phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. A barely contained excitement, like a man trying to hold water in cupped hands. Mom. I need to come and see you this weekend. Something has happened. Are you all right? I'm better than all right. A pause. I'll explain everything when I get there. Just, don't make any plans Saturday. He arrived with Serena. They came in her car, the silver one, and they were dressed as if they had come from somewhere important, which knowing Serena was probably true. They sat across from me at my small kitchen table and Marcus placed his hands flat on the surface the way he always did when he was about to deliver news he had been rehearsing. A distant great-uncle on Daniel's side had died. His name was Howard Bellamy. He had been Daniel's mother's brother, a man I had met exactly once at a family gathering 15 years ago, a thin, reserved man in his 80s who had spent his life in oil and gas and private investment in Texas, who had never married and who had lived, by all accounts, in the comfortable solitude of a man who preferred his own company to the complications of others. Howard Bellamy had died at 91. And in his will, he had left his estate to Daniel's family. Since Daniel was gone, the inheritance passed to his descendants. How much? I asked, and I heard the faint tremor in my own voice that came not from greed but from the sudden memory of everything I knew about what large amounts of money did to families. Marcus looked at me steadily. $30 million, Mom. Divided 3 ways between me, Joel, and Nadia. The kitchen was very quiet. Each of you receives $10 million? Approximately. After taxes and legal fees, roughly 9.8 each. I sat with that. $10 million. Each. My son the attorney who already earned well. My son the electrician who worked hard and lived simply. My daughter the nurse practitioner who had dedicated her career to underserved communities. There is one more thing, Marcus said, and something in the way he glanced at Serena, just briefly, just a flicker, made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Howard left a separate provision. For you. For me? $250,000. A bequest outside the main inheritance, not tied to the 3-way split. I did not know what to say. I had met Howard Bellamy once. Why? Apparently he told his attorney that Daniel used to write to him. Not often. But over the years Daniel sent him letters. Just updates, how the family was doing. Howard never responded much, but he kept every letter. His attorney said he spoke of Daniel with deep affection in his final years. Marcus paused. He said Daniel always wrote about you with great admiration. So Howard left you something in recognition of that. I felt tears form and pressed them back. That was Daniel entirely. Writing letters to a distant uncle he barely knew, because it was the kind thing to do, because he believed in maintaining threads even when they were thin. That's beautiful, I said quietly. Marcus nodded, but his expression did not match the word. There was something calculated in his eyes, something I recognized from another life, from another dining room, from another man who sat across a polished surface and spoke in warm tones about money. We should talk about what you plan to do with it, he said. There's no rush, Marcus. Of course not. Another glance at Serena. Of course not. They left 2 hours later. And I sat in my kitchen after the sound of the silver car faded down Birchwood Avenue, my hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, listening to the city outside my window, and thinking about my father, and about Daniel, and about everything I had learned the first time I lived close to this kind of money. I was not naive. I had never been naive. I had simply chosen, very deliberately, to live as if I were. Joel called that evening. His voice was different from Marcus's. Quieter, slightly overwhelmed. Mom, did Marcus tell you? He came this afternoon. It's insane, isn't it? I keep thinking about what I could do for Carol, for the kids. Pay off the house. Set up college funds. Maybe finally get the shop I always talked about. A pause. Are you okay? I know it must be strange, with it being Dad's uncle. I'm glad Howard knew Daniel was loved, I said. That's what matters to me. Yeah. Joel was quiet for a moment. Mom, Marcus called me before he came to see you. He had some ideas about, well, he mentioned something about pooling the inheritances for investment. Some kind of family trust arrangement. What kind of arrangement? He wants to set it up so everything goes through one vehicle. Him managing it. He says the tax efficiency alone would save hundreds of thousands. I said nothing. I'm not sure about it, Joel said carefully. It seems like a lot of control for one person. Don't sign anything yet, Joel. No. No, I won't. After we hung up I sat for a long time in the dark of my living room. Then I went to my bedroom closet and reached to the top shelf for the cedar box. I opened it and looked at what was inside, a single item, wrapped in a square of old silk. A signet ring. Heavy gold, engraved with the Harrington family crest. My grandmother's. The one thing I had taken from that world when I walked out of it at 22. I had not looked at it in years. I held it in my palm and felt its weight and thought about my father and about choices and about what it means to understand something from the inside. Then I put it back, closed the box, returned it to the shelf, and went to bed. 2 weeks passed. Marcus called 3 times. Each call was friendly, warm, conversational, and each one curved inevitably toward the subject of the inheritance and what I planned to do with my $250,000. He had a financial advisor he trusted completely. He had looked into the tax implications of various options. He was only trying to help. I listened carefully each time. I said I was still thinking. On the 3rd call, something shifted in his tone. The warmth became thinner, like paint applied too broadly over a surface that was not quite dry. Mom, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a little worried. About what? About you managing this on your own. $250,000 is significant. And no offense, but you've never dealt with anything at this scale. I managed the fabric shop finances for 11 years, Marcus. That's different. This is investment-grade money. You could be approached by people who prey on a careful pause, on people who aren't experienced with this. People who prey on elderly women, you mean? I didn't say that. You implied it. And I appreciate your concern. I'll let you know when I've decided on a plan. After that call I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a list. Not of financial options. A list of what I had observed in Marcus over the past 2 weeks. The way he managed Serena's reactions, the way he framed every question as a favor, the way every conversation had a destination he was steering toward while appearing to simply be talking. I had seen this before. In my father. In my father's colleagues. In the men who attended the functions my mother hosted in rooms with chandeliers and talked about money with the comfortable fluency of people who had always had it and intended to always have it. I was not afraid of Marcus. But I was watching him the way you watch whether that might turn. The invitation came on a Saturday morning. A proper one, a card, not a text. Marcus had mailed it, which told me this was carefully staged. He was hosting a family dinner the following Friday. The official reading of Howard Bellamy's will addendum documents would take place that evening, with the estate attorney present. He wanted the whole family together. Joel and Carol, Nadia who would fly in, myself. I called Nadia that afternoon. I already got mine, she said. Very formal. Very Marcus. A pause. Are you worried, Mom? I'm paying attention, I said. Which is different. Nadia was quiet for a moment. He called me about the trust idea. What did you think? I told him I'd need to see the full legal documentation before I agreed to anything. He got a bit cold after that. Another pause. Mom, is everything okay with Marcus? I mean really okay? I think Marcus is going through something that money has accelerated, I said carefully. I've seen it before. In who? I almost said, in my father. Instead I said, in people I used to know. Friday arrived overcast and cool, the kind of March evening that can't decide if it wants to be winter or spring. Joel picked me up. He was quiet in the car, which was unusual for Joel, who was generally as comfortable with silence as he was with conversation, but this was a different kind of quiet. A held breath kind. Did he call you again? I asked. Yesterday. He wants me to sign a preliminary document before the attorney meeting. He says it's just a formality to establish the trust framework. Did you sign it? No. I told him I wanted my own lawyer to look at it first and Joel shook his head. He got loud, Mom. Not shouting. But that quiet loud. You know what I mean. I knew exactly what he meant. Marcus and Serena lived in a large house in a neighborhood I had been to perhaps a dozen times in the 15 years they had owned it. It was beautiful in the way that professionally decorated things are beautiful, cohesive, expensive, impersonal. There were catered appetizers. There were people I did not know, colleagues of Marcus, friends of Serena, people who moved through the rooms with the ease of people accustomed to large beautiful spaces. Nadia found me immediately and hugged me long and hard. You look tired, she said quietly. I'm fine. You look like you're calculating something. I'm always calculating something, I said, and she smiled, though not entirely with amusement. The estate attorney was a man named Gerald Park. He was thorough and professional, and he read the documents in the measured, unhurried tone of someone who had done this many times and understood the weight each word carried. The inheritances were confirmed. $9.8 million to each of the 3 children. $250,000 to Miriam Colette Voss, widow of Daniel Raymond Voss, in recognition of her character and in honor of Daniel's enduring correspondence with the deceased. There was applause. Serena opened champagne. The guests congratulated Marcus with the particular enthusiasm of people congratulating someone who is already successful on becoming significantly more so. And then Marcus stood up and said he had a few words. He talked about Howard Bellamy with the careful warmth of a man speaking well of someone he had barely known. He talked about family legacy and the responsibility that came with significant wealth. And then he said something that made the room go very still in a way I do not think he intended. Of course, as the eldest and as a legal professional, I intend to make sure this family handles this inheritance wisely. Not everyone has the background or experience to navigate what this kind of money requires. And I consider it my responsibility to provide that guidance. He was not looking at Joel when he said it. He was not looking at Nadia. He was looking at me. The room moved on. The guests continued talking. But Joel caught my eye across the room and I saw something there that broke my heart a little, because it was the same thing I was feeling. The beginning of understanding something we had hoped we would not have to understand. Later, as people were gathering their things to leave, Marcus pulled me gently to one side. A hand on my elbow, steering me toward the study at the end of the hall. Serena followed, which I noted, and closed the door behind us. Mom, I want to talk to you about the bequest. I thought we might, I said pleasantly. I've drawn up something simple. It's not a full trust, just an investment management authorization. You give me signing authority over the funds, I work with my advisor to invest them properly, and I guarantee you a monthly transfer of $1,500. The rest grows. You want me to give you legal authority over my money. I want to protect your money. There's a difference. Is there? His jaw tightened slightly. Serena said nothing, but I could feel her attention directed at me like a beam of light through a lens. Mom, I say this with complete respect, you have lived very modestly your entire life. You've never managed anything at this scale. I have. I do it every day professionally. Why would you not let me help? Because help that requires me to surrender control is not help, I said. It's acquisition. The silence that followed had a texture to it. That's an unfair characterization, Marcus said, and his voice had lost its warmth completely now. It was the voice he used in depositions, I imagined. Measured and hard underneath. Perhaps, I said. But I'll be making my own arrangements. I left the study. I found Joel and Nadia in the kitchen and we left together shortly after. In the car Joel drove and Nadia sat in the back with me and held my hand without speaking, which was exactly right. 3 days later, a document arrived by certified mail. I recognized the format immediately. I had grown up watching my father receive documents like this. I sat down at my kitchen table and read it through twice. Marcus had engaged an attorney, not his own firm, a separate one, to petition the court to have me declared a vulnerable adult requiring a financial guardian. The documentation alleged that I had shown signs of cognitive impairment, of confusion regarding financial matters, of susceptibility to exploitation by outside parties. He was offering himself as my financial guardian. I read it a third time. I was extraordinarily calm. This was not because I was not hurt. I was hurt in a way that went so deep it had not yet reached the surface as pain. It was still traveling down there in the dark, moving toward my heart. But I was calm because I had grown up in a world where documents like this were weapons and I knew how they worked. I knew what they were designed to do. I knew what they assumed about their recipient. They assumed the recipient did not know the terrain. I went to my closet. I took out the cedar box. I opened it and removed the signet ring and held it for a long time. Then I called Joel. "I need you to come over," I said. "And I need you to bring Carol if she's available. I have something to tell you both. Something I should have told you a long time ago." They came that evening. Nadia was still in town and I called her too, and she sat on the sofa beside Carol while Joel sat across from me, and I made tea for everyone, and then I sat down and I began to tell them the truth. Not the short version. Not the careful version I had constructed over decades for moments when someone asked about my family and I deflected smoothly. The full version. Beginning with the 14-room house and Gerald Harrington and the two men who tended the garden and the weight of expectation on a young woman's shoulders and the contractor with the paperback novel on the library steps. I told them about walking away from the Harrington name and the Harrington money and everything that came with it. I told them about my father not attending my wedding. I told them about my mother's tears in the third row. I told them about choosing Daniel with every part of myself, knowing exactly what I was choosing and what I was giving up, and I told them that I would make that same choice again every single time without hesitation. I told them that I had kept this secret for 47 years. That Daniel never knew. That I had lived as Miriam Voss so completely and so genuinely that Margaret Harrington had become a ghost, present only in a cedar box on the top shelf of a closet. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Joel's eyes were wet. He pressed his hands together over his knees and stared at the floor for a long moment. Carol said softly, "Oh, Miriam." Nadia was looking at me with an expression I could not entirely read. Not shock. Something more complex than shock. She was reassembling things, I could see it, sorting through memories and conversations and small moments in a new light. "Why didn't you tell us?" Joel asked finally. Not with accusation. With a tenderness that made my throat ache. "Because I didn't want it to define us," I said. "I left that world because I knew what it did to people. I didn't want my children growing up inside a story about wealth given up and wealth owed. I wanted you to grow up simply. To understand the value of things from their actual cost, not from contrast." "But you knew," Nadia said slowly. "You knew everything about money. All those years, you knew." "Yes." "And you watched Marcus become." "I watched," I said. "And I hoped it would resolve differently." Joel stood up and crossed the room and crouched in front of me and took my hands. He was 43 years old and he looked in that moment like the boy who used to bring me dandelions and present them with the gravity of someone offering roses. "What do we do now?" "Now we fight," I said. "But we fight correctly." I called Nadia's attorney contact the next morning. His name was Raymond Cho. He was recommended to me by Nadia, who had used him briefly years ago and who described him as someone who was very good and also, crucially, not easily impressed by expensive suits. But before I go to what happened in Raymond Cho's office, I want to tell you what happened in the 2 weeks between the petition arriving and our first hearing date. Because those 2 weeks were the longest of my life and they deserve to be told honestly. The first week was survivable. Joel came every evening after work. He would sit in my kitchen and we would talk through the documents and I would explain what I knew about legal strategy and he would listen with the focused attention he had inherited from Daniel, who was a man who listened with his entire body. Nadia checked in twice daily from Portland. She had spoken to Raymond Cho on her own and reported that he was quietly furious on my behalf, which she said in a tone that suggested she found this reassuring. Marcus did not call. Not once. The silence was its own statement. He had made his move and was waiting to see what I would do with it. I received, during that first week, 2 other things that I need to tell you about. The first was a handwritten note from Serena, slipped under my door, which told me she was aware of how difficult this was and hoped we could speak privately soon. I read it 3 times trying to determine whether it was genuine or strategic and could not decide. I set it aside. The second was a phone call from an attorney I did not know, a man who identified himself as representing Marcus's interests, who told me in a professionally pleasant voice that there was still an opportunity to resolve this matter before it became a public court proceeding. That if I was willing to agree to a supervised financial arrangement, not a full guardianship, he emphasized, more of a collaborative management structure, we could have the petition withdrawn within 48 hours. I thanked him for calling and asked him to direct all future communications to my attorney. The second week was harder. Marcus's legal team filed supplementary documentation. Affidavits from 2 people characterizing my behavior as confused and erratic. One was from a woman I recognized as a neighbor from 3 buildings down who had barely spoken to me in 5 years of living on the same street. The second was from a doctor I had never visited, who based his assessment entirely on third-party accounts and his general observations about cognitive decline in women my age. I read these documents at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside me and felt, for the first time in this whole ordeal, something close to genuine despair. Not because I believed the allegations, but because I understood the strategy. The strategy was not to convince a judge I was incompetent. The strategy was to make the proceedings messy enough, public enough, exhausting enough, that I would eventually decide a settlement was preferable to a fight. It was a strategy built on the assumption that I was someone who could be worn down. Marcus did not know his mother as well as he thought he did. I called Joel that evening and I said, I need you to tell me something honestly. Anything, he said immediately. Do you ever think of me as someone who could be worn down? A pause. Then a sound that was almost a laugh, gentle and certain. Mom, you're the least wearable down person I've ever known. Dad used to say you were like water. Patient enough to wait and strong enough to cut through stone. I held the phone for a moment. Thank you, I said. I needed to hear that. Are you okay? Not entirely, I said honestly. But I will be. Go home to Carol. I sat for a long time after that call in the quiet of my apartment. The bay laurel in the window box had put out 3 new leaves that week. I watched them in the dim light from the street and thought about Daniel telling his uncle about me in letters that traveled to Texas and were read by an old man sitting alone in a large house, and I thought about how love persists in ways we never anticipate, surfacing in places we never expected to look. Then I went to bed and I slept, which was something I had not managed properly in a week, and when I woke up in the morning I was ready. I met Raymond Cho in his office on a Tuesday. He was in his early 50s, compact and precise, with the habit of absolute stillness when he was listening that made you feel completely heard. I brought everything. The petition documents Marcus had filed. The investment management authorization he had presented to me at dinner. My own financial records going back 15 years showing a consistent, competent, organized financial history. And I brought one more thing. I brought a letter from a law firm in Charleston, South Carolina. The firm that had managed my father's estate. I had called them the day before, for the first time in over a decade. I explained who I was. Not Miriam Boss. Margaret Eloise Harrington. Gerald Harrington's daughter. The attorney I spoke to, a younger man who had taken over the practice from his predecessor, was very professional and very careful, but what he told me was this: my father had died 11 years ago and left his estate to a charitable trust and a distant nephew. But there had been a codicil added in the final year of my father's life. A sealed document that had never been executed because the firm had been unable to locate me. I had changed my name. Completely. Miriam Colette Voss was not findable for Margaret Eloise Harrington without deliberate searching. "What does the codicil contain?" I asked. "Mrs. Voss," he said carefully, "I think you should come to Charleston." I told Raymond Cho all of this in his office. He listened without moving, his hands flat on the desk, his eyes steady. When I finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Voss, your son's petition is extremely weak on its merits. The documentation he has submitted contains no credible medical evidence, relies entirely on subjective characterizations, and would be dismissed by any competent judge once we present your financial history and a current cognitive evaluation. That part is manageable." "And the other part?" "The codicil in your father's estate is potentially a separate and significant matter. I would strongly advise you to go to Charleston before we proceed with the counterfiling." He paused. "What you discover there may change the shape of everything." I flew to Charleston on a Thursday. I had not been back in over 40 years. The city had changed and not changed in the way that cities do. The bones were the same, the light on the harbor was the same, the smell of the air carried something I had buried so deep I had forgotten it was there, and it rose up as I stepped out of the taxi and hit me in the chest like a hand pressed flat against my sternum. I had one evening before my appointment at the law firm. I walked. I did not plan to, but my feet took the route they remembered from 50 years ago and I found myself standing in front of the library 3 blocks from my father's old house. It was still there. Renovated now, newer stone facing on the lower floors, but the broad front steps were the same steps where Daniel had sat with his paperback novel and his sandwich and that complete, uncalculated ease that had undone me at 22. I sat on those steps for a while. A teenager passed me with headphones and a backpack and did not give me a second look, which was correct. I was an old woman sitting on library steps on a Thursday evening in March. I was no one remarkable. I was also, I thought, the woman who had made the best decision of her life on this exact spot, nearly half a century ago. And however painful the current circumstances, that decision had never once stopped being the right one. I walked the rest of the way to my father's old house. Or what had been my father's old house. It belonged to someone else now. A family, clearly. There were children's bicycles on the side porch and lights in the upstairs rooms and a plastic slide visible through the garden gate. The roses were different. My mother had planted pale yellow roses along the front wall and these were red, blowsy, and abundant. But the wall was the same. The iron gate was the same. I stood outside for no more than 2 minutes. Long enough to acknowledge that I had come from here, that this place was part of the architecture of who I was, and that it no longer had any power over me. Then I went back to my hotel and ordered room service and read my book and slept well. The law firm was on a street I had walked 100 times as a girl. I sat across from the attorney, a man named Michael Garrett, and he placed a sealed envelope on the desk between us. "Your father added this codicil 14 months before his death," Michael Garrett said. "He asked that it be held sealed until you could be located or until 10 years had passed from his death, whichever came first. The 10-year window elapsed last year, but we were not," a careful pause, "we were not able to locate you through the channels available to us. You had very thoroughly disappeared." "That was intentional," I said. He nodded without judgment. I opened the envelope. My father's handwriting was inside, which I had not seen in 50 years. It was shakier than I remembered. He had been, I calculated, 84 when he wrote this. "Margaret. I have been a proud man my entire life. I have been wrong my entire life. These two things are not unrelated. When you left I told myself you had made a fool's choice and I permitted myself the luxury of anger because anger is easier than grief and grief, I now understand, was what I was always feeling. Grief that you chose a life I did not build for you. Grief that my love came with conditions so heavy you could not breathe under them. Grief that I never learned to love you the way you needed, without the Harrington name attached." I watched from a distance, as much as a man of my stubbornness was able to watch. I hired people, I am not proud of this, to send me reports over the years. I know you married Daniel Voss. I know you had 3 children. I know you built a good life. A real life. The kind I never had the courage to want. Your mother knew she was dying and she made me promise I would write this. I have broken the promise 11 times before today. I am 84 and I have run out of time for breaking promises. I could not change the main estate arrangements. They were structured in ways too complicated to easily unravel, and I was too old and too tired to fight my own lawyers. But I have set aside a separate amount. Not from the estate. From a personal account I maintained outside the trust structures. An account your mother established jointly with me decades ago, which passed entirely into my name at her death and which I have never touched and which has grown considerably. The amount is $11 million. It is yours, Margaret. It was always yours. I cannot give you back the time or the father I should have been. But I can give you this. And I hope it says what I never learned to say to your face, that you were right, and I was wrong, and the life you chose was the braver one, and I am sorry. Your father. I do not know how long I sat in Michael Garrett's office after reading that letter. He was kind enough not to speak. He brought water at some point and set it quietly beside me and withdrew to his desk and pretended to review documents. $11 million. Sitting in an account for over a decade, growing, waiting for a woman named Margaret Harrington who had so thoroughly ceased to exist that the lawyers could not find her. I want to tell you what it felt like to read my father's handwriting after 50 years. Because I think this is the part of the story that is easiest to simplify and hardest to understand, and I want to try to describe it accurately. It did not feel like forgiveness. That is the first thing I want to tell you. It did not feel like a wound closing. My father had been dead for 11 years. The relationship I had with him, the one I had hoped for and never had, the one I had grieved and eventually made a kind of peace with, was complete. It could not be reopened and renegotiated from his side of the ground. What arrived in that letter was not reconciliation. It was evidence. Evidence that he had, somewhere in the long years of his pride and his stubbornness, arrived at something resembling truth. That the arrival had been too late for either of us to do anything about was simply the shape of that particular grief. Some griefs do not resolve. They simply change form. What I felt, reading his words, was something more complicated than relief and more useful than bitterness. I felt witnessed. I had made a choice 50 years ago that no one who had known me in my first life had ever acknowledged as a valid choice. My father's world, and the people in it, had written off Margaret Harrington as someone who had thrown herself away. And here was my father, at 84, with his shaking hand and his 11 years too late, saying, "You were right. The life you chose was the braver one." That mattered. It mattered not because I needed his validation. I had stopped needing his validation 47 years ago, the morning I stood in a chapel in a dress I had bought at a consignment store and watched Daniel look at me with a love so uncomplicated it made everything that had come before feel like a foreign language. It mattered because it was true. And truth, even delayed truth, even posthumous truth, adds something to the record. My father had watched from a distance. He had hired people to send him reports. He had sat in his large house in Charleston with his 14 rooms and his accumulated wealth and his stubborn pride, and he had watched his daughter live the life she chose, the real life, the life with the contracting business and the fabric shop and the 3 children and the window box of herbs, and somewhere in the watching he had understood what he was seeing. I folded the letter very carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "The transfer documentation," I said to Michael Garrett, when I was ready to speak. "How long does the process take?" 4 to 6 weeks for the full transfer, he said. "Assuming no complications, which there shouldn't be. The account is entirely personal and entirely separate from the estate trust. Your identification, a few signatures, and the funds become fully accessible to you." "Thank you," I said. "Mrs. Voss." He paused. "Your grandmother's estate, which your father inherited partially and managed separately from the main trust, there was also a small personal bequest in her original documents. Jewelry, primarily. There is a ring described as a signet ring," I said. "Heavy gold. The family crest. He looked at me. You have it? I took it when I left. It was my grandmother's. She gave it to me the summer before I married Daniel. She did not tell my father she had given it to me. I stopped. She was braver than my father, in certain ways. She understood what I was doing. She did not say so. But she pressed that ring into my hand and said, "Carry this and remember where you come from, and also remember that where you come from is not all you are." Michael Garrett was quiet for a moment. She sounds remarkable. She was, I said. The only person in that family who really was. I called Joel from the airport. Are you sitting down? I asked. Mom. What happened? I told him. There was a very long silence. $11 million, he said finally. Yes. Mom. He stopped. Are you okay? I think I will be, I said. I need a few days to process. But Joel, this changes things. This changes what Marcus is doing and what he knows and what we can do about it. Does Marcus know about any of this? Not yet. But he will. Raymond Cho, when I told him the full scope of what I had found in Charleston, was quiet for a long moment in the precise way he was quiet when he was thinking very carefully. The 11 million is yours, unambiguously. It transfers directly from a personal account established by your parents and left to you in the codicil. There is no legal complication there. He set his pen down. The strategic question is when and how Marcus learns about it. Because right now he has filed this petition based on a characterization of you as a financially inexperienced elderly woman. If he learns about your background before the hearing, he may withdraw quietly to avoid the exposure. If he learns about it during the hearing. He learns about it during the hearing, I said. Raymond looked at me steadily. He has tried to define me in court, I said. I would like the court to be the place where that definition is corrected. A small pause. Understood, Raymond said. Then we proceed. The night before the hearing I did not sleep. This is not unusual for me in times of significant stress. I have always been a person who lies awake and processes rather than escaping into unconsciousness, but this was a different kind of wakefulness. Not anxious. Occupied. My mind moved through things with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided to look at something clearly rather than around it. I thought about Marcus as a boy. I have a particular memory that comes back to me in difficult moments, unbidden and somehow necessary. He was about 6 years old. We had been to the neighborhood park, he and Joel and I, and on the walk home Marcus had seen a group of older boys with new bicycles, the kind with the gear shifts and the metallic paint, and he had stopped on the sidewalk and watched them with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not envy, exactly. Something more complex. A kind of painful awareness. An understanding, arriving earlier than I had expected it to arrive, that there were things other people had that we did not. I crouched down beside him and I said, "What are you thinking?" He said, very quietly, "Why don't we have bikes like that?" And I said, honestly, because we don't have the money for bikes like that right now. But you and Joel have bikes, and they work well and they will take you anywhere those ones will. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I grow up I'm going to have all the things." I did not tell him that wanting all the things was not the same as needing all the things. He was 6 years old. I just took his hand and we walked home. I thought about that moment in the dark of my bedroom and I wished, with a grief that had grown quieter over time but not smaller, that I had said something different. Something that named the feeling without dismissing it but also offered him another way of understanding it. Something like, it is okay to want things. But the wanting cannot be the center of who you are or it will eat everything else. Something like, your father and I chose this life and the choice was not defeat, it was love, and love is the only thing that actually lasts. I did not have that conversation with 6-year-old Marcus. I had it, in a different form, with 43-year-old Marcus, in my kitchen, over coffee he barely touched. But the night before the hearing I thought about how much earlier that conversation should have happened and held that thought without flinching, because that is the work of a mother who loves honestly. I also thought about Daniel. I think about Daniel most nights, in the way that you continue to have a relationship with someone who has died if you love them deeply enough. Not a haunting. A conversation that simply did not end when one party left the room. I told him about the hearing in the dark. I told him about Charleston and the law firm and my father's shaking handwriting and the 11 million and what his grandmother had pressed into my hand 50 years ago along with the ring. Carry this and remember where you come from, and also remember that where you come from is not all you are. I kept a secret from you, I said to the dark room, to him, to the 40 years of a life shared so completely that talking to its absence felt more natural than not talking. The biggest one. I kept it because I was afraid of what it might change. I think you would have understood. I think you would have said something like, Miriam, that doesn't change who you are. It just explains a few things I was wondering about. I could hear it so clearly. His voice. That quality of warmth in it when he thought he was seeing something true. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, I am going to be the whole person, I said. All of it. Not Margaret Harrington and not a simplified Miriam Voss but both. Because you always saw all of it. That was always the gift. I fell asleep close to 3 in the morning and I did not dream, which felt right. Sometimes the sleep you need is just rest, not message. I woke up ready. I want to tell you what happened in the days before the hearing, because they are part of the story too. Serena came to see me. Not with Marcus. Alone, on a Sunday afternoon, knocking on my door with a careful politeness that told me she was aware she might not be welcome. I let her in. I made coffee. I sat across from her at the kitchen table that had seen so much of this story already and I waited. She was a composed woman. She had always been composed. But that afternoon there were things moving behind her eyes that composure could not entirely still. I want you to know, she said, that I didn't know he was going to file the petition. He told me after it was done. I believe you, I said. I did believe her, actually. I told him it was wrong. She looked at her coffee cup. He didn't listen. He doesn't listen when he's in this mode. It's like he becomes someone I don't recognize. She paused. I've been watching it for years, actually. This thing he does where ambition overrides everything else. But it was never aimed at family before. It was always aimed outward. At work, at competitors, at whatever was in his way professionally. She looked up at me. Until now. He learned it somewhere, I said carefully. Not as an accusation. As a fact. I know you blame yourself a little, she said. I can see it. I kept information from him that might have helped him understand his own nature, I said. That's real. But it is not the same as taking responsibility for his choices. Serena was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I'm going to court, I said. And then, if there's anything left of my son that can be reached, I'm going to try to reach it. She nodded. There was something in her face that I had never seen there before. Not the polished social warmth she usually offered. Something raw. Something that might have been, if I had to name it, respect. She left after an hour. At the door she turned back and said, he doesn't deserve you as a mother. No, I said. But he has me anyway. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in April. Nadia flew back in. Joel took the day off work. I wore a navy blue cardigan and dark trousers and my reading glasses, because I wanted to look exactly like what I was, an older woman who reads books and grows herbs on her windowsill and is entirely capable of managing her own life. Marcus arrived with 2 attorneys. They were both younger than him, well-dressed, carrying the alert energy of people who believe they are winning. Serena was not there, which I noted. Whether that was strategic or personal I did not know. The judge was a woman named Honorable Clara Benitez. She was in her late 50s and she had the expression of someone who has heard every possible version of a story and is specifically interested in the version that is actually true. Marcus's attorney presented the petition. He spoke about cognitive vulnerability in elderly individuals, about the genuine concerns of a devoted son, about the particular risks that financial windfalls pose to people without financial experience. He spoke carefully and professionally, and he did not say anything that was technically a lie, which is a skill Marcus had always cultivated in the people who worked for him. Then Raymond stood up. He presented the financial records first. 15 years of organized, competent, independently verified financial management. He presented Dr. Nwosu's assessment. He presented a written statement from Joel, from Nadia, from my pharmacist of 12 years, from my doctor of 15 years, from my neighbor Mrs. Adeola Brathwaite, who had known me since I moved to Birchwood Avenue and who had written, with a bluntness I found genuinely moving, that if Miriam Voss was cognitively impaired, she personally was in serious trouble because she had been relying on my judgment for years. Marcus's attorney attempted to characterize my refusal to accept Marcus's financial management as evidence of impaired judgment. Raymond responded with a patience that I found admirable. My client declined to surrender legal authority over her personal finances to her son, he said. This is not evidence of cognitive impairment. It is evidence of sound judgment. Judge Benitez looked at Marcus over the top of her reading glasses. Counsel, your client's petition alleges that Mrs. Voss lacks the experience and capacity to manage significant assets. Has your client provided any evidence, beyond subjective characterizations by interested parties, of actual cognitive decline? Marcus's attorney began to respond, and Judge Benitez raised one hand slightly. I'm asking about medical evidence. Independent, clinically administered. We have a physician's assessment. I reviewed the physician's assessment. The physician did not examine the respondent. He reviewed notes provided by the petitioner's family. She set down the document. Continue, Mr. Cho. And then Raymond said, Your Honor, at this time I would like to introduce new evidence relevant to the petitioner's characterization of my client as a financially inexperienced elderly woman without the capacity to manage significant assets. He presented the documents from Charleston. The letter from Michael Garrett's firm. The certified documents establishing the existence of the account established by my father. And my father's letter, which Raymond's paralegal read aloud in full, a young woman with a clear, steady voice, the kind of voice that knows how to honor the weight of words. Margaret. I have been a proud man my entire life. I have been wrong my entire life. The courtroom was very quiet during the reading. I did not look at anyone. I looked at my hands in my lap, at the wedding ring I had never taken off, at the small callus on my right index finger from 40 years of needlework and alterations. I listened to my father's words move through the air of a courtroom in Greensboro, North Carolina, 50 years after they should have been spoken in a house in Charleston with 2 gardeners and 14 rooms and a daughter who was suffocating quietly in its beauty. When it was finished I looked up. Marcus's face was altered. Not in the dramatic way of people in films who receive devastating news. Subtly. As if something that had been very slightly misaligned had been, with a small and irresistible pressure, shifted into place. He was staring at the table in front of him, and his hands, which were always still and controlled in professional settings, were not entirely still. He was understanding. I watched him understand. The woman he had characterized as financially naive had grown up in a house larger than anything Marcus had ever owned. The woman he had taken to court had walked away from a family fortune by choice, at 22, with full knowledge of what she was giving up. The grandmother who tended herbs on a windowsill was the daughter of Gerald Harrington. The grandfather Marcus had never known was a man whose wealth would have made the Bellamy inheritance look modest. She had seen all of this before. Every move Marcus had made, every calculation, every pressure technique, she had watched its template operate at the highest levels for the first 22 years of her life. And she had chosen to leave it. Deliberately and completely and without regret. He had been trying to manage someone who understood the game better than he did. Had always understood it better. And had chosen not to play it. Raymond Cho completed his presentation. He summarized my financial history, Dr. Nwosu's assessment, and the Charleston documents in the precise, unhurried tone of a man who knows the conclusion before the argument is over. Mrs. Voss, he said, turning to me for a moment, is not a financially inexperienced elderly woman. She is a woman who chose a modest life with complete understanding of the alternatives. That choice is not evidence of incapacity. It is evidence of exceptional character. Judge Benitez looked at the documents for a long time. She looked at Marcus. She looked at me. Mr. Voss, she said, and her tone was perfectly controlled. Based on what you have heard this morning, do you wish to maintain your petition? Marcus's attorneys leaned toward him. There was a brief, quiet conference. Then Marcus stood up. He did not look at his attorneys. He looked at me. And I held his gaze and I did not look away, because I had not looked away from this boy in 43 years and I was not going to start now. No, Your Honor, he said. The petition is withdrawn. Given the evidence presented this morning, Judge Benitez said, the petition appears to have been filed without credible evidentiary basis and with a conflict of interest that borders on the abusive. She paused. I am formally dismissing this matter with a notation that the respondent has demonstrated complete and unambiguous competence in every relevant category. She removed her glasses. Mrs. Voss. Yes, Your Honor. You may manage your affairs as you see fit. Entirely. Without condition. She brought the gavel down. The four of us, Joel, Nadia, Raymond, and I, walked out of the courthouse into an afternoon that had finally decided to be properly spring. The trees along the courthouse steps were just beginning to bud, small and tentative and determined. Joel put his arm around my shoulders and I let him and we stood there for a moment in the light. How are you feeling? Nadia asked. Tired, I said honestly. And something else. I don't have the right word for it yet. Relief? Maybe. Or maybe just the feeling of something that has been held very tightly for a very long time finally being set down. Raymond shook my hand. I'll be in touch about the Charleston transfer. It's straightforward from a legal standpoint. The money is yours. After he left, the three of us stood on the courthouse steps together. And Joel said, quietly, what happens with Marcus? I had been thinking about this for weeks. I had been thinking about it in the way that you think about things you know are inevitable but are not ready to face. Marcus was my son. He had tried to use the law as a weapon against me. He had characterized me as mentally incompetent in a legal document. He had tried to steal from me, not the money, or not only the money, but the thing that is harder to replace than money, my autonomy, my dignity, my right to be seen as a full person rather than a problem to be managed. And I also knew, because I had been watching him for 43 years, that he had not done this from nothing. I knew where it came from. I knew the shape of it, because I had grown up inside the same shape. The hunger to be significant. The terror of returning to a version of yourself that feels insufficient. The way wealth becomes not just a resource but a proof, a defense, a substitute for the thing you actually need. I knew these things because I had looked at them clearly at 22 and chosen differently. And Marcus had never had the information that would have let him make that same choice. Part of that was on me. I want to stop here for a moment and say something to you directly, because I think it matters and I think sometimes we skip past it. I am not a saint. I want to be clear about that. There were days in those weeks between the petition and the hearing when I felt not the measured grief of a wise woman but a white-hot fury that I recognized as entirely human and entirely justified. There were nights when I lay awake rehearsing things I wanted to say to my son, things that were true but that I would have said with a sharpness designed to wound rather than to illuminate. There were moments when I thought, let him face the full legal consequences. Let the procedural sanctions fall on his firm. Let his colleagues know what he tried to do. Let it all come down. I felt those things. I did not act on them, but I want you to know I felt them, because I think there is something dishonest about stories that present the wronged party as existing entirely above their anger. I was not above my anger. I carried it through those weeks like a stone in my coat pocket, aware of its weight, holding it carefully, choosing each day not to throw it. What kept me from throwing it was not nobility. It was memory. Specific, involuntary memory of the kind you cannot choose and cannot suppress. Marcus at 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in our small house in Greensboro, working through a mathematics problem with a concentration so fierce it looked like pain, and then looking up when he got it right with an expression of pure joy that he did not yet know to hide. Marcus at 16, finding me crying in the garden the afternoon Daniel's contracting business lost a major contract, sitting beside me without saying anything and putting his arm around my shoulders with the careful, earnest tenderness of a boy who had not yet learned to be armored. Marcus at 25, calling me from his first real job offer, his voice so full of everything he had worked for that I cried again, but differently, with a pride that was cellular, that came from somewhere below language. That boy was still in there. I knew he was. I had watched enough wealth damage enough people to know that what it does is not destruction but burial. It buries. It layers. It covers the original person with successive coats of performance and defense until they themselves forget what is underneath. My job, as I understood it, was not to punish the layers. It was to find the way back to what was buried. He came to see me 2 weeks after the hearing. He came alone, without Serena, without attorneys, without a briefcase or documents. He came in the same car but he parked it down the street and walked to my door and knocked like a man who was not sure of his welcome. I let him in. I made coffee. I set 2 cups on the kitchen table and sat down and waited. He sat across from me. He looked like he had not been sleeping well. There were lines around his eyes that had deepened and his shoulders, usually held in the precise posture of a man who takes up space deliberately, were slightly folded inward. I don't know where to start, he said. The beginning is generally reliable. A long breath. I'm ashamed, Mom. That's the starting point. I'm ashamed of what I did, and I'm ashamed of what I thought about you, and I'm ashamed that it took. He stopped. I needed a judge to tell me my mother was competent before I listened. That should have never been in question. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup and said nothing. The Charleston thing, he said. The letter from grandfather. He pressed his lips together. I had no idea. No. You didn't. You chose a simple life. You chose Dad and the small house and the fabric shop and, he shook his head. You could have had everything. And you chose nothing. I chose everything, I said. You're not listening carefully enough. He looked at me. I chose your father, I said. I chose 3 children. I chose a life where I knew the cost of things because I paid for them myself. I chose to understand money from the outside rather than from the inside, because I had already seen what it looked like from the inside and I knew what it did to people. I paused. I chose to give you the childhood I gave you so that you would grow up understanding that love is not conditional on financial standing. Because my father never learned that. And I did not want to pass it on. But you didn't pass it on to Joel or Nadia. No. The word sat between us. What did you pass on to me? He asked, and his voice was very low. I thought about this carefully. I think, I said, that the secret itself may have done some damage. Not telling you where I came from. Not showing you the map of what I chose and why. You grew up seeing our modest life and you assumed it was all we were capable of. You assumed it was a ceiling rather than a choice. And without knowing it was a choice, you could not understand what the choice meant. That's not an excuse for what I did. No. It's not an excuse. It's context. You still made choices, Marcus. Your choices. He was quiet for a long time. Outside my window a bird was singing, something cheerful and relentless. I want to make this right, he said. I don't know how. I know I can't just, I know sorry is not enough. But I need you to know that I know that. And that I'm going to spend however long it takes understanding what I did and undoing what I can undo. There are things you cannot undo, I said. I know. But there are things you can do. And I am going to tell you exactly what they are. I told him about the Daniel Voss Foundation. About the structure we were building, the financial literacy programs, the mentorships for first-generation students. I told him that what this family had been given, not just Howard Bellamy's 30 million, not just my father's 11 million, but the whole accumulation of what we had lived through and learned, was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be used. Your grandfather Harrington spent his whole life accumulating and protecting, and it made him a man who couldn't attend his daughter's wedding, I said. Howard Bellamy spent his life accumulating, and then at 91 he wanted it to mean something. Your father spent his life building and giving, and at the end he was writing letters to an uncle he barely saw because it was the kind thing to do. I looked at him directly. Which of those men do you want to be? Marcus was quiet for a long time. I want to be the third one, he said finally. I just don't know how. You learn, I said. The way everything worth knowing is learned. Slowly, with help, with the humility to admit when you're wrong. I paused. You could start by calling Joel. In the months that followed, things did not become simple. They became real, which is different and harder and ultimately more worthwhile. I want to tell you what that looked like in practice, because I think the word redemption gets used loosely, and I want you to understand what it actually means when it happens in a kitchen and a parking lot and a foundation office and not on a stage. The first thing Marcus did, after the hearing and before coming to see me, was call Joel. Joel told me about it afterward. Marcus called on a Saturday morning and did not say much. He said he was sorry, that he had been wrong, that he did not expect Joel to respond to that immediately or at all. Joel, being Joel, said, "Come over for dinner next week." That was the whole conversation. No grand statements. No negotiated reconciliation. Just, come to dinner. Joel told me this over the phone, and I had to set the receiver down for a moment because the love I felt for my younger son in that moment was so large it had nowhere to go. The second thing Marcus did was contact the two people whose affidavits had been used against me. The neighbor from 3 buildings down and the doctor who had reviewed my file without meeting me. He wrote them each a formal letter of retraction, taking full responsibility for the characterizations in their statements and clarifying that the representations made to them were his own and not factually supported. He sent me copies. I read those letters carefully. They were written in legal language, precise and thorough. They were also, and this is the detail I want you to hold, written in the first person singular throughout. No passive constructions, no deflection, no mistakes were made. I did this. I was wrong. I take responsibility. Whatever else Marcus had been in those months, he had been trained his entire professional life in the art of precise language. When he chose to use that precision in service of honesty rather than self-protection, it was its own kind of statement. The third thing he did was resign from the partnership track at his firm and spend 6 months working as a court-appointed legal advisor for families navigating elder care disputes. He told me this on a phone call in September, matter-of-factly, the way you report a decision already made. Elder care disputes, I repeated. I understand them very well now, he said. From both sides. Marcus began therapy. He told me this without prompting, on a phone call in June, in the same straightforward tone he used for important professional matters, which told me he was taking it seriously. He said he had begun to understand that his relationship with money and status and control was not just a professional habit but a wound that had been unaddressed for decades, and that the work was uncomfortable but necessary. Serena did not leave him. I had thought she might. But she told me once, in a brief and oddly vulnerable conversation we had when Marcus was not present, that she had married him because she saw something in him that reminded her of her own father, and she had spent 15 years not wanting to examine that too closely, and the events of the past year had forced her to examine it completely. He's different now, she said. Not finished. But real. For the first time he seems genuinely real. Daniel used to say that real was better than perfect, I told her. She looked at me for a moment. I think I would have liked Daniel. Almost everyone did, I said. The question of the money was settled over several months of careful legal work. The $11 million from my father's account transferred to my name, and I worked with an independent financial advisor to establish a structure for it. A modest living allowance for myself. A significant educational trust for Joel's 3 children. A substantial endowment to Nadia's community health clinic. And the foundation, small, focused, principled, named for Daniel. I asked Joel to co-manage it with me. He said yes without hesitation, in the voice of a man saying yes to something he has been waiting his whole life to be asked. Nadia contributed an endowment specifically for mental health and social work support services at her clinic in Portland, which had been running those programs on volunteer effort and grant cycles for years. The funding she was able to provide through her share of the Bellamy inheritance, supplemented by a portion of the foundation's operations budget, meant 3 full-time positions she had been unable to fill for 6 years. She called me on the day the first hire accepted their offer, and I could hear in her voice the exact quality of joy that comes from being able to do something you have wanted to do for a long time and could not, until now. Dad would have loved this, she said. He would have been characteristically understated about it, I said. He would have said, "That's good, Nadia, that's really good," and then changed the subject because he didn't like fuss. She laughed. And then he would have told everyone he met about it for the next 6 months. Yes, I said. Exactly that. There was, 3 months after the hearing, one more thing. Howard Bellamy's estate attorney contacted us about a personal letter from Howard himself, misplaced during the initial estate review, addressed to Daniel's children. We gathered at Joel's house to read it together. Marcus was there, sitting quietly in the corner with his coffee. I read it aloud. Howard Bellamy had kept all of Daniel's letters. And in those letters Daniel had told him things with the unguarded honesty of someone writing to a person he liked but did not see often. He had written, in a letter from his final illness, about a woman he had loved for 40 years who had given up something significant to be with him, though he did not know exactly what, and who carried some weight he had never been able to lift for her, and who was the finest person he had ever known. Howard's letter was addressed most directly to Marcus near the end. "Young man," it read, "I have never met you, but I know you through your father's words. Your father was proud of you and troubled by you in equal measure. He believed you would find your way. I am leaving this money to your family not because I think it will make you happy but because I think you need to discover, through your own choices, that it cannot. That is the only lesson worth learning. I hope you learn it gently. Most of us learn it hard." Marcus folded the letter very carefully and set it on Joel's kitchen table and pressed his hands flat on it. "I learned it hard," he said quietly. "Yes," I said. "You did. But you learned it. And that is what matters." The room was quiet for a moment. Joel's children were in the other room, audible as background warmth, the sound of young life going on without knowledge of what the adults in the kitchen were carrying. Carol had brought tea and placed it on the table and gone to be with the children, which was exactly right. Nadia was looking at Marcus with an expression I recognized as the particular face she wore when she was making a clinical assessment, which was not something she could entirely switch off even in family settings. She had told me once that after 15 years in medicine she could not unhear what a person's voice told her about what they were carrying. She said Marcus sounded exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You should come to Portland sometime," she said to him. "We have a family day at the clinic every spring. Kids from the programs come with their parents. It's not impressive. It's not a gala. But it's real." Marcus looked at her. Something in his face shifted. "I'd like that," he said. Joel looked at me across the table. He did not say anything. He raised his coffee cup slightly, just slightly, in a gesture that said everything it needed to say. We were not the same family we had been a year ago. Some things that had been broken were still broken. Some things that had been buried were now visible and would need tending. But we were still a family, still gathered around a kitchen table in the house of a man who had his father's heart, still in the process of becoming whatever we were going to become. The letter from Howard Bellamy sat in the center of the table. An old man in Texas who had spent his life alone and accumulated everything and used the last of it to tell the truth to people he had never met. Who had read a dead man's letters for years and understood something about love and loss and the choices people make when they think no one is watching. I thought, thank you, Howard. For keeping the letters. For reading them. For seeing what was in them. I thought, thank you, Daniel. For writing them. Then I picked up my tea and I said, who wants more? I think there's enough for another round. I am writing this from my kitchen table. It is morning. The rosemary is growing well in the window box and the bay laurel is thriving, putting out new growth with the unhurried confidence of something that knows exactly what it is. The coffee is good. The crossword puzzle is in front of me and I have already done the upper left quadrant, which is my habit, because I like to start with what I know and work outward from there. That, it occurs to me, is also more or less how I have lived my life. I know who I am. I know where I came from and I know what I chose and I know why I chose it. I started with that knowledge 47 years ago and I have worked outward from it ever since. The secret I kept was not about shame. It was never about shame. It was about protection. Protecting my children from a story that might have shaped them in ways I had already seen shaped people badly, protecting the life I had chosen from the gravitational pull of the life I had left. I do not know, even now, whether keeping the secret was the right choice. I suspect the honest answer is that it was partly right and partly wrong, the way most significant decisions are. It protected things worth protecting. It also left gaps in my children's understanding of their own history that cost one of them considerably. If I had told Marcus at 18 that his grandmother's family had been wealthy and that his mother had walked away from it, would he have become the man who filed that petition? I cannot know. I can only know what happened and what I would do differently and carry that forward. What I would do differently, I would tell the story earlier. Not the full architecture of it, not every detail, but the shape of the choice. I would tell my children, your grandmother had more options than she used. She chose the ones that led to your father and to you. I think that story, told simply and without drama, would have given Marcus something he spent his whole career trying to acquire from the outside, the understanding that a modest life can be a chosen life, and that a chosen life is its own form of wealth. I am writing this, and the bay laurel is growing in the window, and in a few hours Joel will call to talk about the foundation, and on Sunday Marcus is coming for dinner with Serena and their daughter, who is 11 years old and who has her grandfather Harrington's jaw and her grandfather Daniel's eyes and who is already, in the precise way of 11-year-olds who are paying close attention to everything, beginning to understand that the adults around her are more complicated than they appear. Her name is Eloise. Marcus told me they chose it because they liked how it sounded. He did not know, when she was born, that it was my middle name, the name I had kept from my old life, the private thread connecting Miriam Voss to Margaret Harrington. When I found out he had named her that I sat with it for a long time. Then I told him the story, the whole story, and he was very quiet, and then he said, I didn't know. But somehow I knew. I held his face in my hands the way I had when he was very small. Some things get passed down without words, I said. Pay attention to what you pass to her. He is paying attention. I can see it. It is the work of a lifetime, paying the right kind of attention. But he is doing it. That is enough. That is more than enough. There is a lot I did not know when this began. I did not know about Howard Bellamy's letter. I did not know about my father's codicil. I did not know that Daniel had been writing to his uncle for years, quietly, faithfully, maintaining a thread I never even knew existed. I did not know that my grandmother's cedar box had a twin sitting in a law office for 60 years, waiting for me. But there is something I did know, and have always known, and that I want to say clearly because I think it is the most important thing I have to tell you. I knew that the life I chose was worth choosing. I knew it at 22 when I walked away from the 14 rooms and toward a man reading a paperback novel on a library step. I knew it every day I managed the fabric shop and grew herbs on the windowsill and sat at a kitchen table with a crossword puzzle and a cup of tea and felt the specific deep contentment of a life that cost you something real to build. The money my father left me is not a correction of my choice. It is not a proof that the choice was wrong and the wealthy world was right all along. It is simply money, and money is a tool, and what matters is what you build with it. I am building a foundation that teaches young people what I had to learn the hard way, that financial literacy is not the same as financial obsession, that understanding money is not the same as worshipping it, and that the wisest thing you can do with wealth, if you are ever fortunate enough to have it, is to use it in service of something larger than yourself. My son tried to take my dignity. He failed. Not because the court stopped him, though it did. But because dignity is not something that can be taken from someone who understands its source. My dignity does not come from money. It does not come from the Harrington name or the 14 rooms or the signet ring in the cedar box. It comes from the 47 years I spent building a real life, from the choices I made in full knowledge of the alternatives, from the love I gave and received and continue to give. My husband knew something without knowing the whole story. He knew it from the way I lived, from the choices I made when no one was watching, from the woman I was when there was nothing to prove to anyone. He knew it so deeply that he wrote about it to an uncle he barely saw, year after year, in letters that were never answered and never stopped. Daniel Voss loved a woman and never knew she had been someone else before she was his wife. And the love was real and complete without that knowledge, which is the whole point. The whole, exact, irreducible point. Who we are is not what we come from. It is what we choose, every day, with full knowledge of what we are choosing and what we are leaving behind. I chose love over furniture. I chose a real life over a beautiful empty one. I chose Daniel on the library steps and I would choose him again in every version of every life I might have lived. And I kept, from my grandmother's cedar box, one letter she had written that I did not find until it came to me from a law office in Charleston. It said, "Eloise, whoever you become, be that fully. The rest is just furniture." I placed that letter in my own cedar box beside the signet ring. The box lives on the top shelf of my closet, where it belongs. Not hidden. Not displayed. Simply present. The way the past should be, acknowledged, honored, and no longer in charge. If you are carrying a secret that has grown heavy, I am not going to tell you to put it down. Some secrets protect things that are worth protecting. But I will tell you this, the truth has a weight of its own, and when it finally comes out, and it will, one way or another, it is better to be the one who speaks it than the one who is spoken about. Tell your truth. Own it when it surfaces. Stand in its light without flinching. And if someone is trying to tell you that you are less than you are, smaller, simpler, more manageable, look them calmly in the eye and know what I know. Some of us have seen the whole board. We just chose not to play. Share this with someone who needs to hear that a quiet life can be the bravest choice. Someone who has been dismissed or underestimated. Someone who is fighting for their dignity and wondering if it is worth the cost. It is worth it. Every time. Without exception. God bless you. Take care of the people you love. And never, not for a single moment, confuse what someone is worth with what they own.